The Pima County Sheriff's Department posted something this week that the internet did not forgive. In the middle of one of the most closely watched kidnapping investigations in the country, in a case where a missing woman's name is Nancy, the department published a post announcing it had located a woman named Nancy. The internet, and the thousands of people who have been following the Nancy Guthrie case with sustained attention, received that post as what it plainly appeared to say. Nancy Guthrie had been found. She had not been found. The Nancy in the sheriff's post was a different person entirely. A different woman. A different situation. An 82-year-old named Nancy Radakovich, located through a search in circumstances that had nothing to do with the Guthrie investigation. The department has not provided a credible explanation for how it decided to publish that post, in that form, in that context, without apparent recognition of how it would land. The reaction was immediate, wide, and intense. The post was described as tone-deaf. It was described as very unfortunate. It drew the kind of reaction that moves from social commentary into the realm of institutional accountability. People who had allowed themselves to believe, even for a moment, that the news they had been waiting for had arrived, and who then had to process the correction, had experiences that went beyond ordinary frustration. And the department that caused that experience has offered no adequate response. That is the opening scene of a week that added new chapters to the Nancy Guthrie case across multiple dimensions. A ransom note placing her in Mexico, a former FBI agent's psychological profile of the suspect, a fourth detention near Tucson, and a daughter who continues to carry this situation in public view in ways that her audience cannot help but notice and interpret. This is where the case stands, fully examined. The Sheriff's Department post requires more than a passing reference because it represents a pattern that is now established in the public record, rather than an isolated incident. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has, over the course of this investigation, produced a series of public communications that have each, in their own way, damaged the relationship between the department and the community it is serving. The characterization of the current sheriff by a former superior as a vindictive bully. The misleading alert about Nancy Guthrie's status that was sent earlier in the investigation, and now this. A post about a different missing Nancy, published without apparent awareness of its context, that triggered a national reaction. When each of these incidents is examined individually, it is possible to construct an explanation that makes each one seem like an isolated error. People make communication mistakes. Alerts get sent imprecisely. Posts are published without full consideration of their timing. These things happen. But when 3 separate incidents produce 3 separate waves of national criticism in the course of a single investigation, the individual incident explanation becomes harder to maintain. A pattern is a different kind of problem than an error. And the pattern here is one of a department that is not managing the public communication of a high-profile case with the care and precision that the case requires. The specific reaction to the Nancy Radakovich post is worth examining in detail. The public's response included the kind of language that signals not just frustration, but a sense of betrayal. People who have been following the Nancy Guthrie case are emotionally invested in an outcome. They have been holding space for the possibility of good news. When what appears to be good news arrives in the form of a law enforcement post, the credibility of the source is what makes it feel real. When that credibility is then revealed to have been misplaced, the emotional experience of the audience is not simply neutral correction. It is a version of the false resolution that makes subsequent uncertainty harder to carry. The phrase tone-deaf, which appeared widely in coverage of the incident, is worth unpacking. Tone deafness in an institutional context is not simply insensitivity. It describes an organization that has lost the ability to perceive how its actions will be received by the audience it is communicating with. An organization that is tone deaf does not necessarily intend harm. It simply cannot hear the signal that tells it when its actions are landing wrongly. That diagnostic, applied to the Pima County Sheriff's Department in the context of this investigation, suggests that whatever internal review processes exist in the department are not adequately calibrating the communication decisions being made. The federal investigation that is running parallel to the local agency's involvement does not depend on the department's credibility. The FBI's laboratory work continues regardless. But the local investigation, which involves community relationships, witness engagement, neighborhood intelligence, and the ongoing relationship between law enforcement and the public in Tucson, is affected by every incident that reduces the community's trust in the local agency managing it. The ransom note that claimed Nancy Guthrie is alive in Mexico brought the most significant new information into the case this week, and it deserves careful, sustained analysis. A second communication from whoever is holding Nancy Guthrie, or whoever is representing themselves as holding her, was received by Savannah Guthrie. The note's content included the claim that her mother is alive and in Mexico. That is a specific geographic assertion. It is the kind of claim that is either true, in which case it represents a major breakthrough in understanding where Nancy Guthrie currently is, or false, in which case it represents an attempt to direct investigative attention and the family's emotional resources toward a location that serves some purpose for the sender. The response to the note from law enforcement has been cautious. Police in Scottsdale offered clarification about a related situation in their area, suggesting that what was found or reported near Scottsdale does not confirm Nancy Guthrie's location. That clarification, while not directly addressing the Mexico claim, suggests that investigators are actively managing multiple geographic threads simultaneously, and that none of those threads has yet produced a confirmed sighting. The characterization of the note as a taunt, rather than a negotiation, is significant. In kidnapping cases where ransom is the primary motive, communication from the perpetrator is typically oriented toward creating conditions for a transaction. It is designed to maintain the family's belief that the victim is alive and that compliance with demands will lead to a return. Communication that is designed to taunt, to cause pain, to demonstrate power without advancing any transactional objective, suggests either that the primary motive has shifted or that it was never primarily transactional in the first place. A former FBI agent who assessed the psychological profile of the suspect this week used the phrase God complex. That language, in the vocabulary of criminal psychology, describes a specific orientation toward authority and consequence. Someone operating with a God complex in the context of a kidnapping does not experience the social and psychological inhibitions that typically moderate criminal behavior. They are not afraid of being caught in the ordinary way. They may actively enjoy the process of evading law enforcement, and they may view the communication with the family as a form of theater, in which they are the author and director, controlling the experience of people who cannot respond effectively. If that profile is accurate, it changes how investigators need to think about the Mexico claim. A person operating with a God complex does not necessarily send false information to mislead investigators. They might send true information because they believe they are untouchable, regardless of what law enforcement knows. The Mexico claim, in that reading, might be accurate precisely because the sender believes it does not matter whether it is accurate or not. Investigators are working through all of those possibilities simultaneously. Their public statements reflect the necessary restraint of an active operation. What they know internally about the note, its physical characteristics, its delivery method, and what those characteristics tell them about its origin has not been made public. The subscription to this coverage is the best way to receive the next development in this case as quickly as it becomes available, and the case is generating new developments at a pace that rewards close attention. The fourth detention near Tucson is a development that has received less attention than the ransom note this week, but deserves careful examination in its own right. According to reporting, a fourth individual has been detained in the vicinity of Tucson in connection with the Nancy Guthrie case. The specific circumstances of that detention, who was detained, what prompted the detention, and what was found or discussed as a result have not been made fully public. In an active investigation, that level of detail is typically withheld until investigators have fully processed what the detention produced and determined how it fits into the broader investigative picture. What the fourth detention tells the public is something structural about the investigation. 4 detentions in the vicinity of Tucson in the course of this investigation suggests that law enforcement has been actively testing hypotheses about who might be connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Each detention reflects an investigative judgment that a specific individual warranted a closer look. Not every detention produces actionable information. Not every person detained is ultimately found to be connected to the crime. But the pattern of detentions is itself a signal about the nature of the investigation's active phase. When investigators detain someone in a major abduction case, they are typically doing so because some combination of circumstantial evidence, witness information, forensic data, or behavioral analysis has directed their attention toward that individual. The accumulation of 4 such detentions over the course of the investigation suggests that the field of possible suspects is being actively narrowed, even if none of the 4 detentions has yet produced the confirmation investigators are looking for. The connection between the detentions and the DNA analysis currently being conducted by the FBI is something investigators understand clearly, and the public does not. If the FBI's analysis of the hair samples recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home produces a profile that can be matched against DNA from a specific individual, one of those detentions may provide the reference sample needed for that match. Or the match may come from a database comparison. In either case, the detentions are not happening in isolation from the forensic work. They are part of the same investigative process. The 4th detention near Tucson also raises questions about the geographic relevance of the Tucson area to the investigation. If the person or persons responsible for the abduction had connections to Tucson beyond simply the location where the crime was committed, that connection would be reflected in the investigative focus on the area. 4 detentions in the same geographic region suggests that investigators have reasons to believe the relevant actors in this case have ties to that area that go beyond the single event of the abduction itself. The motive question has also received renewed attention this week. Multiple sources have attempted to address why Nancy Guthrie was specifically targeted for abduction. The working framework in the public record is financial, that the abductor believed the family had access to significant resources and that a kidnapping for ransom would produce a financial outcome. But the escalation of communication from demand to taunt and the psychological profile offered by the former FBI agent introduced the possibility that the motive has dimensions that go beyond the purely financial. A pre-existing grievance, a personal connection to the family, a psychological compulsion that is separate from financial gain. These are possibilities that investigators consider in every kidnapping case, and they are worth keeping in the analytical frame as this case continues to produce information that does not fit neatly into the expected pattern of a straightforward ransom kidnapping. Savannah Guthrie's presence in this case, her visibility as a public figure moving through a private crisis, is something that this week has brought into sharper focus than any week before it. She was seen departing her morning broadcast mid-episode. The departure was unplanned. It was visible. Fans immediately reached for interpretations that connected the departure to her mother's case. Whether that connection is accurate has not been confirmed, but in the context of a case that every member of her audience is aware of, an unexplained absence in the middle of a live broadcast carries meaning that the audience assigns, regardless of the actual reason. She was also described this week as subtly showing her true feelings about the ransom notes while on air. That characterization, showing true feelings subtly, describes a moment where professional composure meets personal reality in a way that is visible to people watching closely enough to perceive it. The fact that observers noticed and reported on a subtle emotional display speaks to the level of attention that is being directed at Savannah Guthrie's every visible moment as a gauge of the case's current state. The description of what Savannah Guthrie is experiencing as a campaign of terror is language that appears in the reporting this week and that deserves direct engagement. A campaign of terror, in a legal and investigative context, describes a sustained pattern of behavior designed to cause psychological distress to a specific target. The ransom notes sent to her personally, the taunting quality of the most recent communication, the maintained uncertainty over a period of more than 10 weeks, compose something that is more than an ordinary criminal demand. They compose a targeted, sustained effort to harm a specific individual through the manipulation of information about someone she loves. If investigators are approaching the communication in this case through the frame of a sustained psychological campaign, rather than simply a ransom demand, that changes the investigative strategy. A sustained campaign is a behavior pattern. Behavior patterns leave traces. They reflect psychological needs and operational habits that are consistent across time. The person who sent a taunting note claiming Nancy Guthrie is in Mexico is expressing something about themselves, not just communicating a message. That expression is investigative material. The Dateline coverage of the case and the viewer reaction to it added another layer to the public understanding of this investigation this week. Viewers described the case as making no sense. That reaction is not simply an expression of confusion. It is a signal that the case is departing from the expected narrative structure of kidnapping cases, the structure that most people have absorbed through media and public information about how these cases typically unfold. Cases that do not follow expected structures are experienced as unsettling, not just emotionally, but cognitively. They resist the patterns that ordinarily allow people to track a developing story and anticipate its trajectory. That cognitive dissonance is, in its own way, a reflection of something real about the case. The Nancy Guthrie investigation genuinely does not follow expected patterns. The planned nature of the abduction, the taunting communication, the God complex profile of the suspected perpetrator, the extended timeline with no resolution in either direction, the geographic complexity introduced by the Mexico claim. These elements in combination produce something that is unusual by the standards of how these cases typically unfold, and that unusualness is felt by everyone following it, including experienced investigators and criminologists. What happens next in this case is something that genuinely cannot be predicted from outside the investigation. The FBI's forensic work may produce an identification. The Mexico lead may produce a location. One of the 4 Tucson detentions may produce a match. Or the case may continue to generate developments that extend the timeline and add complexity, without yet providing the resolution that the investigation and the family are working toward. The question of why Nancy Guthrie was targeted is one that has received renewed attention this week, and it deserves more than passing treatment, because the answer to that question shapes every other element of the investigation. In kidnapping cases, motive is not simply background information. It is an active investigative tool. The motive tells investigators who had a reason to commit this specific crime against this specific victim. It tells them what the perpetrator was expecting to gain, and it tells them how to interpret subsequent communication, including the ransom notes, through the lens of what the perpetrator actually wants versus what they are saying they want. The financial motive framework has been the primary public frame for this case from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of a nationally recognized public figure. The assumption that the family has access to significant financial resources is not an unreasonable one for a criminal to make. A kidnapping for ransom targeting someone connected to a wealthy or prominent family is a crime type with a documented history in the United States and internationally. The existence of an initial ransom note supports the financial motive frame. But the second ransom note, characterized as a taunt, and the psychological profile of someone operating with a God complex introduce complications into that frame that investigators will be working to resolve. A kidnapper, whose primary motive is financial, does not typically shift from demand to taunt. The taunt does not advance the financial objective. It may feel satisfying to a particular psychological type. It may serve a purpose that is not purely transactional, but it does not move the case toward the conclusion that a financially motivated kidnapper would be working toward. The alternative motive frameworks that investigators consider in cases like this include personal grievance, which would mean someone who has a specific reason to target this family beyond the financial calculation. It includes psychological compulsion, which would mean someone for whom the abduction itself and the subsequent psychological campaign serve a need that is not primarily about money. And it includes the possibility of a combination of motives, a financially motivated crime that is being conducted by someone whose personality also drives them toward behavior that goes beyond what the financial objective requires. The former FBI agent's God complex assessment connects most directly to that last possibility. Someone who committed a financially motivated kidnapping, but who is also operating with a God complex, might be perfectly capable of mixing genuine ransom demands with taunting behavior, because their relationship to the crime is not purely instrumental. They are not simply executing a transaction. They are enacting a power relationship. And in that power relationship, the taunting note is not a departure from the plan. It is part of the plan. The former detective's observation that the kidnapper had a plan from the beginning supports this reading. A plan that includes both financial demands and psychological pressure campaigns against a publicly visible family member is a sophisticated plan. It requires forethought about what the abduction would produce beyond its immediate logistical execution. It requires anticipation of how the family would respond, how law enforcement would respond, and how those responses could be leveraged or manipulated to serve the kidnapper's objectives. That level of planning is unusual. It narrows the field of potential perpetrators to people with a specific combination of intelligence, operational capacity, and psychological profile. And it makes the investigative profile built by the former FBI agent and the former detective not just informative, but potentially decisive in identifying who is responsible. The fourth detention near Tucson may reflect exactly that investigative profile being applied to actual suspects. If investigators have constructed a behavioral and operational profile of the perpetrator based on the available evidence, they can use that profile to identify individuals whose known history and characteristics match. Each detention represents a test of the profile against a real person. Not every test will match, but each one that does not match also helps refine the profile for the next test. This is how investigations of this kind move toward identification, even when they have not yet produced a confirmed match. Day 75 ends this way: active, complex, unresolved.